Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots was supposed to be the end of Metal Gear, or more specifically Hideo Kojima's involvement in Metal Gear. So much so that he made the entire game about endings, about reflecting on the series' history, for better and for worse. And yet, like MGS3 and then 4 after it, he just couldn't let it go. Not long into the development of the next entry, Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker for the PlayStation Portable, he stepped back up to direct and lead development on the title. This makes Peace Walker a bit of an odd game. Despite lacking the big number 5 in the title, the game began as Metal Gear Solid 5, and Kojima kept saying in interviews leading up to release that it essentially was MGS5. And yet, it was on a less powerful system that, through its portability, practically necessitated a different approach for structure, one that likely wouldn't suit the long cutscenes and narrative sequences the series was known for. Additionally, Peace Walker is nestled between Metal Gear Solid 3 and Metal Gear 1 timeline-wise, in a comfortable spot that doesn't put any pressure on it to actually lead anywhere. It picks up where one left off and could presumably end where another begins, free from the burden of finality, something Kojima evidently struggles with. So Peace Walker sort of reads as an experiment, an opportunity for Kojima and the team to try a bunch of stuff. And while that's fun, it also feels like it cheapens the whole concept of this being a saga. For all its faults, Guns of the Patriots manages to find its focus as it comes to terms with the fact that this whole thing is ending. There's a real resonance between Snake, the development team, and the player, but Peace Walker seems like it could disrupt that resonance by being a minor work within the series, sort of tacked on after the fact. It doesn't help that the main theme of the game is peace, questioning why we have war or armies in the first place and the concept of nuclear deterrence, which are all worthwhile ideas, but I'd say that literally every Metal Gear game already explores these ideas. They tend to be the thematic backdrop underneath the previous central themes of gene, meme, scene, and sense. Over my time covering Metal Gear, I've repeatedly referred to the series' themes as an interconnected web, disparate parts creating numerous connections between each other to coalesce into something larger, a fascinating body of work. But from that perspective, Peace Walker, with its theme of peace, seems like it's just there to fill in gaps in that web, rather than acting as an origin point from which threads can extend out of. None of this means the game's going to be bad, mind you. It is largely considered to be one of the best PSP games ever released, but this is the first time I'm playing Peace Walker after completing the rest of the series in release order. And so when approaching it from that angle, it's tough not to be skeptical about its very existence, especially as someone whose primary interest is the way narrative and gameplay work together. Despite being a bit cynical about its ambitions, I'm excited to see how Peace Walker holds up under my new perspective. So let's get into it. For the first time in the Solid series, the title screen doesn't focus on the protagonist. We simply see a static screen flickering as though a broadcast has ended with the game's logo, a peace sign made out of an aircraft, in the bottom right. It's quite eerie, and in its restraint becomes more resonant. The static suggests that something has been interrupted, perhaps peace itself, while also implying that we're not being shown something. Taking place in 1974, Peace Walker is the first Metal Gear game post the US's direct involvement in the Vietnam War, and by extension the proliferation of TV broadcasting about war. It feels pointed that the story of Peace Walker is never one that will be public, because of how the US has since adapted their narrative control to a new era. In that way, the presumed perfunctory nature of Peace Walker and its place in the timeline makes sense. This is a story that won't be told by history, because to do so would expose what an empire does to preserve its own peace. Upon starting, we see Naked Snake at a shack for his new NGO, Militaire Sans Frontières, or Army Without Borders. He's in Colombia, and it's 10 years after he disappeared at the end of Metal Gear Solid 3. Recruits for MSF are training on the beach, with Snake walking down to get involved. Strangely, he's seen with the same snake-shaped scar on his chest as the boss. Refreshingly, you're given control of Snake right away. It's only so you can do some tutorials, but it helps cut to the chase. Snake hasn't really changed much since the end of MGS3, he's sort of just stewed and become embittered, so we can get control of him right away as there's little catching up to do. In keeping with the time frame, Peace Walker borrows stylistic cues from Vietnam War films like Full Metal Jacket and Apocalypse Now. It hones in on being cerebral, grounded, and sullen. From these tutorials, you pick up that Snake has fervently thrown himself into combat, possibly as a distraction from what was done to him in Snake Eater. We even see that he refuses to be called Big Boss, still preferring Snake all these years later. You're soon interrupted by Snake's partner at MSF, Kazuhiro Miller, and some guests who have come along with him. One guest is Professor Galvez from a university in Costa Rica and his student Paz. They've seen an armed group shipping weapons into the country and believe the CIA may be funding them. As Costa Rica has no military of its own, Galvez hopes to hire MSF to investigate the group, principally at a supply port that they've been spotted using. As payment, they can provide Snake with an offshore plant that MSF can operate out of, expanding as they go on. This introduction prioritizes the establishment of tone and a relatively simple initial goal. It understands how enmeshed in the series' history it is, divulging enough to pique a new player's interest, but not so much that veterans of the series have to slog through redundant information. A less wordy opening like this also plays into the gritty stylistic choices. Comic book-esque cutscenes draw heavy influence from Yoji Shinkawa's artwork for the series. Details are scratchy and ill-defined, things always feel a little left to the imagination. Peace Walker never loses sight of the limitations at play in regards to this new approach to presentation and shifts its priorities accordingly. Colour is used very deliberately, and motion comes less from the moving of a camera and more from the panels themselves. Cutscenes establish good rhythms of tension, becoming more still as the conversation settles before it jumps back to life with animation as the exchange heats up. The prologue lets you out onto a beach with a few weapons at your disposal so you can get accustomed to the controls better. This is a pretty big departure, considering how the series tends to prefer to acclimatize the player with an initial gameplay area, but it makes sense. Peace Walker retains some of the modernizations from MGS4's control scheme, like the crouch walk and over-the-shoulder aiming, but has to work around the PSP's more limited suite of inputs. There's just less fidelity of control, and some staples of movement, like the prone crawl, are omitted entirely. Overall it works, the game's deliberately designed around these choices, but some aspects like switching between weapons and items feels a bit clunky throughout the whole experience. As Snake exits the beach, we flash back to one of the grimmest conversations ever penned. Miller's trying to convince Snake to take on the job, and by extension expand MSF to essentially become a private military of mercenaries, even though he swears that won't happen. Psst, it will. Snake sees right through the whole thing, being confident that the forces in Costa Rica are CIA-backed and that Galvez is probably with the KGB. There's this prevailing sense that Snake can see how everything will go down, what he'll be creating by investing in MSF, but that he also maybe doesn't care anymore. The whole thing feels doomed because we know how much of Metal Gear is precisely about not doing what Kaz is proposing here, so to see it happen because of the apathy of someone we sympathize with is really rough. Surprisingly, Galvez just levels with Snake. He outlines the Soviets' plans for Central America, to back the Sandinistas in Nicaragua so they can overthrow the regime, with the revolution helping spread socialism across the continent from there. As is typical for the series, Peace Walker treats the Cold War as a conflict between two equal ideologies and forces, which gets especially thorny when focusing on Latin America. The region has been exploited and controlled by foreign powers for the purpose of resource and, by extension, capital extraction for over 400 years, since the Spanish and Portuguese expanded their empires there. In an effort to flatten things in service of its own themes, Peace Walker doesn't invoke this history often. It is a game that cares about self-determination for the people of these countries, but sort of treats them as pure, non-ideological beings who've been influenced towards one of two futures by evil meddlers. When engaging with the history of the region would allow the game to illuminate a more complicated reality. But I digress, this is something we can get into more once we actually know more. The facility Galvez wants you to infiltrate was where Paz got captured and imprisoned, and where her friend still remains. Paz's friend happened to get a recording of some people talking with the boss's voice sticking out. The possibility of the boss being alive convinces Snake to sign on, though he tells himself it's for Paz. This first mission has a very functional construction, having a sympathetic human aspect with Paz, an overarching political one, and something familiar and character-driven with this glimpse of the boss. It does this while refreshingly flipping the script in some ways, like being briefed by someone you're assumed to be skeptical of, but who then seems to drop his facade right away. Peace Walker hasn't used his position in the timeline to settle so far, which is exciting. Snake's dropped off into the jungles of Costa Rica, and the first mission finally begins. This is when Peace Walker employs design more reminiscent of the beginning of other games in the series. You start out in a small area with a few stationary guards wearing bright orange uniforms. There's a couple paths to take that are cordoned off with rather high ridges and some items to pick up along the way. It's simple and obvious, but really just exists to get you used to navigating a space with guards in it, even if they don't pose much threat. As you go, cars will highlight your health bar, sight gauge, camo index and radar, giving you an indication of what you should be paying attention to while playing. The second area then steps things up a bit. It's reminiscent of Metal Gear Solid's first screen, with a grid of shipping containers. You now have to deal with moving guards and the idea of elevation, while in an environment that makes you stick out much more, as Snake's fatigues don't blend in very well with the concrete and metal. There's not much more to say gameplay-wise about this first mission, but that's precisely the point. Its only real goal is to get you used to the structure of missions and gameplay, not just in that it's a briefer experience, but that you won't be prepared for every possible situation, what with your limited inventory. So being familiar with the fundamentals of the stealth systems is important. Snake sneaks up on a comms guy at the facility and takes him out. You see an odd flying vehicle with a computerized voice as well as a map telling you where the cargo is being taken, out west to the mountains. The radiation film badges and cargo codename of Spears is a dead giveaway. The CIA is bringing nukes into Costa Rica. Although able to get some intel, Snake still needs some more info, so the next step is to get into contact with the Sandinistas. You then get your first look at Mother Base. It's basically a set of menus that you navigate, but you get some proper visualization from the zoomed out view in the background. Like stealth gameplay, it's only introduced quite simply, showing you how to assign staff to different sections of the base, and how leveling each respective one up might get you more resources or the ability to develop new weapons, items, or tools. With your initial set of MSF members, you'll likely level up your R&D team and accrue gross military product, or GMP, to start developing an upgraded tranq pistol and the analyzer. In order to progress the development of these things, you have to complete missions or operations. You could get right into the next main operation, but you'd probably want the new gear for that mission, so instead you take on the first extra op. This involves navigating the shipping container area from the first level to zip a soldier up to Mother Base using the Fulton system, which is just a fancy balloon, and is actually first mentioned at the end of the Virtuous mission in MGS3. So this is how you get more staff for MSF, and therein lies the entire gameplay ecosystem of Peace Walker. It's a loop of staff acquisition which feeds into item acquisition, which opens up new gameplay possibilities for missions, which then push the story forward, and so on and so on. I won't get any deeper into the weeds of this stuff yet, but it's worth establishing it here to look at how efficiently it gets you enmeshed in this process, so that you feel like you're making progress immediately. Before Snake can go and seek out the Sandinistas, you have to go through the preparatory process, as you do for every mission. The game will give you a rough idea of what you can expect in terms of terrain and point out any compulsory items needed, but outside of that, it's up to you what you take into an operation. I think this concept works quite well for Peace Walker. Missions tend to contain between 5 and 20 minutes of gameplay, and you have just enough slots to take some reliable things with you, while maybe branching out a little to try something new. So even if your inventory doesn't pan out quite how you thought it would before starting the mission, adapting sort of just becomes a new fun challenge. You will at least always have the stun rod, which is a quiet way to knock guards out, putting 5 stars above their head as opposed to the 3 from a CQC knockout, meaning they'll take longer to wake up. This method of inventory management really only sours in boss fights, but we'll get to that when it's more relevant. The Fulton is the real big gameplay addition to Peace Walker. It's not touted as some massive feature, but it's the one thing that threads the entire experience together. As Metal Gear's enemy AI has become more complex, the continuity of an area has become increasingly important. Soldiers will patrol and notice when something is missing, or go and wake up any knocked out allies, possibly going into a caution phase where they actively seek you out. The Fulton gives you the chance to completely eliminate someone from the play area, and thankfully these CIA guys are dumb as bricks and never realize this. This makes the Fulton an incredibly valuable resource. It doesn't only get rid of that enemy, but preserves the status quo of the area. In turn, the play space is altered as a small section of risk-free territory opens up, a point on the map from which you can safely observe and make your next move. As such an invaluable tool, Fulton balloons are in pretty short supply, and you can only take 8 to 15 or so with you on each operation, depending on how much you've developed them back at Mother Base. This adds a brilliant element of resource management to Peace Walker's missions. Back in my Snake Eater video, I mentioned how its systems are created to allow the player to make immediate, short-term and long-term decisions, giving a great sense of agency over your play, where it feels like everything you do has some sort of effect. Peace Walker, as a much simpler game, doesn't quite have this same approach, but the Fulton is the one place where it does. You don't just have to think about how you'll use it in the current area, but how many uses that will leave you for the next area and the whole mission. This directly influences how you conduct yourself. And of course, those captured soldiers then get put to work on Mother Base, so you want to snatch only the best of the best. Using the analyzer, you can discern this, again influencing when you do and don't use the Fulton. And as mentioned, those soldiers then give you the ability to develop new items or possibly upgrade current ones. And so how you use this central tool has really large ramifications on the circular economy of playing Peace Walker. As I said, it truly ties the entire thing together, and without it, actually playing Peace Walker would be way less engaging. Because as noted, the CIA guards in Costa Rica aren't very bright, are quite nearsighted, and might have some hearing problems. You can get within like 5 meters of their direct line of sight before they think someone might be there, and sound is way less of a concern than earlier games. They also don't really work together at all, patrolling as single units and not scanning the horizon too much. Areas are also much smaller and self-contained, flanked by transitory loading screens on either side. This means you don't have to sit and observe much to get an idea of where everyone is. Level layouts are just generally less subtle and interwoven. When you take the adjusted enemy AI, the shift in design, and also the new ranking you get at the end of each operation, which largely prioritizes speed, it's pretty obvious that Peace Walker is meant to be a more improvisational stealth experience. The previous games would try to instill the idea of a routine into the player to teach them what things they should be looking out for so they could succeed. But Peace Walker has enough grey areas and fudged lines of discoverability that you can take things as they go way more, which is where the Fulton comes back in. It doesn't just give your play more purpose and form, but helps you get out of sticky situations you didn't anticipate, precisely because it lets you wipe the slate clean and remove a guard from play. This is certainly a new pace for Metal Gear, but not an unwelcome one. It's still quite fun and very suited to the PlayStation Portable. In Metal Gear Solid 3, its airtight ecosystems of mechanics is weakened a little bit by how powerful a stealth tool the Silence Trank is, as you can come to rely on it too much rather than branch out and experiment. And Peace Walker can suffer from the same thing. With so few stealth tools at your disposal early on and the encouraged faster pace of play, it's very easy to codify your tactics within the first few missions, creating habits that limit your diversity of gameplay. As such, playing Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker can be really rewarding while capturing the tension of a great stealth game in a new way for Metal Gear as a series, but as you progress it can also get repetitive and predictable. For this early mission, however, those habits haven't formed, and it naturally ramps up the density and diversity of guard placement, making for a pretty fun time as you approach the cabin where the revolutionaries are shacked up. The leader you're looking for is dead, but his daughter Amanda is still alive and able to give you a direction to head in. The unmanned flying vehicle from earlier re-emerges, and Chico, Amanda's brother, gets snatched, with her and the rest of the crew taking off after him. The cutscene has some interactability to it where you aim and fire rockets at enemies. There's also plenty of QTEs throughout the game, which is very much a product of its time. Like most games, these don't really add anything or communicate the feeling of being able to exercise agency during narrative moments. It's more just a way to turn the game into Dragon's Lair for 12 seconds at a time. I love the introduction to the Sandinistas though. Amanda, as someone trying to transition from being a part of a team to leading one, is someone Snake feels he can shape in a positive way to some extent. He imparts wisdom, but not in a patronizing way. This is significant as it shows him once again shifting into that mentor-type role that he took on for Ocelot, and that the boss took on for him. This relationship is a way for us to see how he's growing, even as he threatens to regress and sabotage himself as the prospect of the boss still being around presents itself. It's not only Snake who has actual respect for the Sandinistas, but the game as well. Unlike so many other titles, it doesn't do a bunch of hand-wringing moralizing about the revolutionary characters in its narrative. Metal Gear as a series is so ensconced in war and conflict that it's willing to discern and explore the motivations and context around the different participants in these situations. A lesser game would be stumbling over itself to explain how the Sandinistas aren't afraid to use violence, and then act as though that makes them as bad as their oppressors. Peace Walker is willing to extend its theme of peace, and the wish to attain it, to the Sandinistas, despite the fact that they're not afraid to pick up a gun. And this willingness to treat Latin American people, let alone explicitly politicized ones, as capable of agency and self-determination is relatively uncommon within artistic depictions, at least those not coming from the region itself. It lends legitimacy to that central theme and how overarching it is within the experience. The next mission, where you follow Amanda's trail in hopes of getting more info, picks up literally exactly where the previous one left off, which raises a weird structural wrinkle of Peace Walker. In true Metal Gear fashion, the story is very linear, but now with these new management systems and side ops in play, there's a superstructure imposed upon the game that exists outside of traditional gameplay. The main story of Peace Walker isn't just a linear series of events, but a linear series of events buried in menus and amongst other optional content as well. So how you embody play becomes quite odd. Big Boss is the leader of MSF, and so ostensibly that's who you, as the player, embody. But the main ops are so interlinked that there's no way he's making all these decisions about who to assign where and what to develop. So when you manage MSF, who are you exactly? This isn't a question I actually need an answer to, but it is a question that exists, and so there's some ambiguity created in the experience which allows for tension between the main story and that aforementioned superstructure to coalesce. I'd imagine for most people this doesn't matter, which is fair enough, but I've always really liked how Metal Gear tries to avoid artificiality in its design and communication. In its ambition for naturalism, you get great details like guards verbally stating suspicion rather than an annoying detection meter like you'd see in a Far Cry game, for example. So it's a little disappointing to see this naturalism largely dismissed here in Peace Walker, at least outside of when you're completing a singular operation. This isn't my preferred structure for a Metal Gear game, but the side content tends to be slight enough that your time doesn't feel wasted by it, and like a lot of things in this game, it makes more sense when you put it in the context of the platform it was intended for. And it does allow for some cool things even within the main story. From the very first game, Metal Gear has designed its stealth encounters so that they can be refreshed when approaching them from a new direction. And with this more bite-sized structure in Peace Walker, there's an opportunity created to give familiar areas a new instance, so to speak, where guard layouts, density, and so on are changed up. You will trudge through the same locations a decent amount of times, and though it can get stale, it doesn't do so as quickly as you might expect, which is nice. Having been developed for such a specific device, Peace Walker acts as a good excuse to interrogate the series' conventions, and whether they should be changed or not. This most radically manifests in the structure, as we've seen, and with it the treatment of artificiality. In any given interaction, Peace Walker prioritizes efficiency and clarity, and so what was communicated invisibly before is now put on the screen, most notably button prompts for guard interactions. Interrogating guards, getting items from them and so on is much friendlier, although personally I don't think that necessarily makes it better. As you near Amanda, you're ambushed by the first boss in the game, a Lav-type G tank. Now a lot of my quibbles with Peace Walker are things that, given you were playing this handheld each day, I could completely understand people liking. But these vehicle boss fights are not one of them. Peace Walker just doesn't feel properly equipped to have these fights within it. The most straightforward tactic of just shooting all the guards in the tank has always been the preferable method to me, as trying to do these things stealthily makes the encounter interminably long, but these vehicles have so much health that the straightforward approach isn't that much better. Your limited inventory leaves you running out of ammo, which means a few minutes of each boss is wasted on requesting supply markers. Even beyond the more immediate mechanical concerns, the vehicle encounters feel so out of place. They're the worst type of boss, one where there's the big enemy who has a bunch of standard enemies around it to cheaply distract you so you can get hit by the big enemy. Also, the actual arenas are weirdly barren and spare, and as you fire away over and over and over, it feels like you must be doing something wrong, because surely this can't be going as intended. But it is going as intended, and also kinda not. These boss fights can be done in up to 4-player co-op, and in that context they make a lot more sense. When playing with others, you can split attention between the grunts and vehicle better, the space would just be filled up more, there'd be less downtime for supply markers, and the whole thing wouldn't feel as long and samey. But while I can find it reasonable that a PlayStation Portable game would expect me to play it on the go, I do not find it reasonable for a PlayStation Portable game to expect that I can reliably find other people to play that PlayStation Portable game with. I was a kid in the PSP era, and even then I only knew one person who had one. Truthfully, this tank tangle and the rest of the vehicle bosses weren't as bad as I feared, but that's because I already knew from my previous playthrough that the most painless course of action was to just gun everything down, and also to do all the side ops as they became available so that I could have the latest weapons developed in preparation for them. But a new player doesn't know that, and when I was a new player, I fucking hated these things. There's also the fact that these encounters are replacing the typical member of a goofy villain team fights, which while they sucked in MGS4, have historically been a great avenue through which to get cool, outlandish characters. With the take taken care of, Snake's able to catch up with Amanda, saving her from the unmanned drones, though getting injured in the process. She divulges that the Sandinistas have been funding their efforts via drug refining, however the CIA's commandeered it, leaving the group out of options. Snake asks Amanda to join MSF, casting no judgment on what she and her people have had to do, also agreeing to save Chico from the village he's headed up to in the mountains. This feels like the first time in the series where you actually see the legend of Big Boss get written in front of you. People across the series talk about how he brought them in when no one else would, gave them a purpose. Snake Eater is placed in the perfect spot in the timeline, leaving enough of a gap in the continuity so that you can extrapolate that in-between time yourself. And Peace Walker risks taking what players have imagined happened and replacing it with something worse. But thankfully it hasn't done that so far, and what it has done is quite compelling. To find Chico in the village, you have to check through the peepholes of buildings with blue doors. Having a more interactive objective than just getting to a place helps augment stealth and how you interact with the space, as checking a building involves hanging in one spot as guards continue on their patrols. As Snake goes through the same rigmarole with Chico, convincing him to join MSF, his methods shift a little. He tries to be paternalistic, but still harsh, scaring Chico straight in a way as he tries to grow up too fast. But at the same time, Snake carefully frames his private military as the more logical option. Which on some level it is. Chico's 12 and his older sister's already there, but Snake never honestly represents what MSF is, using people's heightened emotional states and desperation to convince them it's more neutral than it really is, considering that it survives by profiting off of conflict. Peace Walker doesn't try to make this interaction sinister or anything, it lets the player get swept up in Snake's world-weary charisma as well, so that you can more easily see how Big Boss would have so many devoted followers. Snake even points this out himself, saying,
"Remember, real heroes are never as polished as the legends that surround them."
Chico points you in the right direction to follow the nukes, and as you make it to a train yard you see the nukes continuing onward through a tunnel. Unfortunately, you're taken by surprise by another tank which caves in the tunnel, leaving you without a way forward. To actually make the tank fight bearable, I needed to develop another rocket launcher, so I went and did some side missions. Side ops generally fall into a few different archetypes, like shooting ranges, Fulton extraction missions, target demolition, or even just refighting previous bosses. They generally take that idea I explored before of Metal Gear reorienting pre-established spaces for new stealth challenges to the extreme. There aren't many extra ops that I'd say are bad, but also not a lot that particularly stand out, especially early on. It's like the VR missions from MGS 1 and 2 have been made part of the central experience, rather than some side things separate from the campaign, which isn't a negative move per se, but it doesn't make me more interested in them. And that would be that, if extra ops were just something you could take or leave. Technically you can, I suppose, but some items for development can only be found in these missions, and you want to be recruiting more and more soldiers so that you can stay on top of your base's progression. And because of how MSF functions, you'll sometimes find yourself with time to kill, and doing an inconsequential but nonetheless new operation is better than just replaying some story mission. Extra ops are a cool idea and an integral part of the game's larger structure, but the actual content of the missions fails to feel as integral as their place relative to the rest of Peace Walker's moving parts. Sometimes the main missions can be just as inconsequential. With the tank out of commission and the tunnel blocked, Chico advises you head back to the village he was taken to and blow up a barricade there, which will give you access north and to the enemy's base. So first you have to backtrack through some areas to get back to the village, and then you blow up the barricade and can move on to the meat of the mission, right? No, it just ends there. This whole main mission is just backtracking. The first steps of real progress you make are as the game fades to the results screen. It's not a massive deal, you can just move on to the next main op and get on with it, but it shows how Peace Walker's rigidity can work against the larger experience, creating many perfunctory moments and this weird dichotomy in gameplay, where there's all these little fuck around parts and then the real game where stuff actually happens. I don't doubt that it works for some, but I've always loved how focused Metal Gear games are, and this is a very clear step away from that. Thankfully, the next mission is better. It peaks as you come face to face with a fort, guarded by about 7 soldiers, with the rocky terrain and sheer wall making it a pretty tough spot to navigate without getting seen. It's wonderfully tense and pointedly building off of Peace Walker's smaller inventory and options for engagement, showing that the game can still be just as compelling as any other entry in the series when it really goes for it. You come to a hangar filled with trucks and find the one you tailed, in the process spotting a poster of Mei Ling and recruiting Kojima to MSF. You move deeper into the facility and see some bold guy and an Otacon-sounding nerd arguing. The weapon being developed sounds much like a Metal Gear, with its main goal being deterrence, which it will ensure by demonstrably having the capability to launch a nuke from anywhere, on account of being able to walk. Otacon 0.5 gets pushed down the stairs by who we learn is Coldman. Snake follows him and we see as Metal Gear Peace Walker is airlifted out of the facility. Another vehicle then hops into the arena, the Pupa. The Pupa fight is basically a juiced up version of the tank ones. It has more offensive and movement capabilities so it can target you in a variety of ways, which in turn requires the player to adapt to a few different scenarios. There's also just one target, which makes things way better. It feels like you can actually get in a satisfying groove with your gameplay. There's not many boss fights throughout the series I'd say this is better than, but it's at least more interesting than the standard vehicle fights here in Peace Walker. Once Pupa is taken care of, you're introduced to Huey, its creator. Snake introduces himself as an entomologist, saying he's looking for a Ulysses butterfly. Previously, he mentioned he was trying to photograph butterflies. He's using these titles to avoid saying what he actually is, and it's pertinent that it's a butterfly. In Metal Gear Solid 3, Snake, having lost his eye and been confronted with his actions by the Sorrow, fails to capture a butterfly in his hands as it flutters overhead. It represents how he feels disconnected from himself and his role in the mission, having to kill the boss. It also shows how he's unable to truly connect with Eva because of how the Times has put them on opposite sides of the conflict. Later on, he molds a heart-shaped C3 explosive Eva gave him into a butterfly and throws it up in the air, catching and planting it. In a way, it's triumphant because he's regained his confidence, but it's also a statement on what he's destined to become. It's violent and forceful, a declaration that he'll push away love to stay in his comfort zone of conflict. Any trepidation or confusion about his place in the world has been squashed. He's submitting to fighting for the rest of his life. And so just now, we've seen the butterfly emblazoned on the surface of Peace Walker. Snake, refusing to embrace the path he himself seems so sure of in Snake Eater, is suddenly thrown back into confusion upon hearing that the boss may still be alive. He's desperately trying to recapture the past, and without realizing it, just chasing another butterfly. We know that once he captures it, he will destroy it and inevitably find himself walking the exact same path towards outer heaven that he'd slowly veered away from. We've already destroyed the pupa, and next it will be the chrysalis and cocoon, before Snake's transformation, and in some ways regression, is solidified, becoming Big Boss. This process mirrors the stated goal of Project Peace Walker, at least as Huey outlines it for us. As an AI-powered, nuclear-equipped walking tank, it removes the human element of firing a retaliatory nuke, thereby acting as the ultimate force of nuclear deterrence theory, the idea that no one can fire a nuke because the inevitable retaliation would destroy the world. But as we've already seen, the leader of the CIA's presence here, Hot Coldman, truly the Sam Porter Bridges of his day in terms of Kojima names, feels that in order for the project to truly establish itself as a force of deterrence, it must first verifiably launch a nuke. So much like Snake running away from his identity issues only to inevitably end up at the same place, this weapon, presumably meant to deter nuclear weapons, will have to use them itself. Although I think it's cool how Peace Walker syncs up Snake's personal journey with the main theme, peace, and how people try to attain it, the deterrence talk isn't particularly interesting. As I said earlier, this topic has been covered by the games plenty of times before, and Coldman's methods of achieving foolproof deterrence aren't novel enough to be a fun thought experiment. In the previous games, the main villains, despite being batshit insane, usually provided some character-driven angle with which to view them, and maybe honed in on one or two very legitimate grievances. But Coldman doesn't really do that. He's larger than life, sure, but not large enough to make all this repeated sentiment worth sitting through. Huey points us toward a lab nearer the border where we can destroy the yet-to-be-finished AI pod for Peace Walker, stopping the project in its steps. He also joins MSF and offers to use any relevant resources you grab to build your own bipedal weapon. Snake heads north through the cloud forest and towards the lab. You eventually come to a clearing and take down the helicopter you're faced with. Once it's destroyed and the mission's over, you unlock the final piece of MSF management, the recruit tool. I believe it retrieves soldier data from your friends' bases, but surprisingly people from my Xbox 360 friends list weren't keeping up to date with Peace Walker all that much, so I couldn't make use of it. But it's worth checking back in on MSF as a whole now that it's fitted out. By this point you have a medical, food and intel team in addition to R&D and combat, but managing these doesn't become a problem until late game when you start hitting staff limits. For now it's just a matter of assigning soldiers to one based on what their biggest meter is. Developing new tools and upgrading current ones conveys a sense of progress quite well, and it is exciting to try new things or see how they've changed, but unfortunately they're largely lethal, non-silenced weapons. Most of the things you can develop are only really usable in boss fights or once stealth has already been broken, which plays into the reliance a player can develop on certain items. You will get some cool things like magazines to lay, a rudimentary version of the solid eye and a ballistic shield, but these legitimately compelling additions are few and far between. There's also outer ops. These are simulated skirmishes that you can use your soldiers in, setting up a team and then sending them out to fight. Victory will usually nab you some items and possibly new blueprints to develop, while also increasing the skills and by extension value of the participating soldiers. This is a cool system and one that allows you to develop some sort of relationship with your soldiers via character growth, especially considering they can die in these missions. It also shifts focus of mother-based progress away from pure recruitment churn. You're not left just fultoning everyone you see so you can systematically replace your current recruits with higher skilled versions. This is also where you can put any vehicles you salvage to use, and slowly taking on more difficult ops can be satisfying. Like I've said though, MSF operates on a lot of menus and stats. Each soldier has not just their base expertise stats in terms of R&D, intel, etc., but also a range of combat-specific stats that affect things like weapon preference, accuracy, and so on. There's a level of depth here that the benefits of outer ops do not reward engaging with. The idea that you're going to consult this long list of stats so that you can optimize any given squad to succeed in a mission is absurd to me. Granted, the game doesn't foreground these extra details, you have to go a step deeper to see them, so Peace Walker isn't strictly requiring this level of engagement. But without it, Outer Ops pretty quickly becomes quite mindless, which feels somewhat representative of the whole base building aspect of the experience. It's smartly integrated into the larger ecosystem of mechanics and can be rewarding here and there, but also harbours this level of depth and specificity that the game can't hold up its end of the bargain on. Whenever I tried to pay closer attention to putting a squad together for Outer Ops, the rewards didn't feel worth that time. Yet not engaging with it to that extent can then feel too surface level and hands off. There's lots of great aspects to MSF, but it never quite strikes that balance of complexity it needs, at least for how I want to play the game. But as this side of Peace Walker gets more fleshed out, some interesting thematic content emerges. In his book, The Open Veins of Latin America, Eduardo Galeano elucidates the history of unequal exchange that Latin America has been subject to over the past 500 years. It roughly played out like this. After all the natural resources of these countries are extracted by foreign actors, their economies each get defined by usually one or two agricultural exports like coffee beans, bananas, or sugar. Tariffs imposed by organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, and GATT ensure these nations each remain dependent on these exports, over time becoming more and more subordinate to outside capital, because countries in the imperial core are the main buyers of these crops, and oftentimes the owners of the companies farming these crops. These foreign actors were initially the Spanish or Portuguese, then the British Empire, and in more recent history the US Empire. With so little power over the function of their economies, wages in the exploited nations lag behind, leaving the people of these nations with little to no upward mobility and financial agency, continuing to centralize Latin American economies around certain resources. Right-wing, conservative or liberal, governments in the region would historically see a further normalization with their exploiting trade partners as their path to greater internal development, like improving infrastructure and, relevant to our focus, expanding schooling, especially tertiary education. With these new universities, a lucky few students in the exploited country would be able to get a degree in something considered valuable, like engineering or science, but then find that due to how the economy had been molded to serve the needs of the imperial core, that there wasn't much work for them in their home country, moving away to that imperial core, thereby benefiting the exploiter even more. Now, this is pretty broad, but if you look at the larger diffuse flow of capital throughout what I've outlined, you see something that mimics the process of building MSF to some extent. We're jumping in at 1974, so the exploiter-exploited dynamic has been well established for centuries, and you can see that with how Peace Walker highlights primarily coffee and bananas. There's a codec call with Paz specifically about bananas being central to Costa Rica's economy, another about coffee, and a cutscene where Chico gives you some directions, where the only real man-made landmarks he mentions are banana or coffee plantations. These two crops are a significant part of Costa Rica's identity. These people's land is defined in large part by resources that are only so prevalent because of how they're beneficial to another nation. So there's a precedent set for this being something worth interrogating within Peace Walker and why that may be. If we follow this precedent and map it to the process of imperialism I've outlined, you see how Big Boss mirrors the exploited nation here. He, as someone from the United States and more generally as a foreigner leading MSF, enters into Costa Rica and begins literally airlifting people off to his base and then benefiting off their accrued skills, as the growth of MSF provides him with more capable and deadly tools. Granted, most of these guys are presumably CIA agents, but they may also just be Costa Ricans paid off by the CIA. And Snake does ingratiate himself with the Sandinistas, and you do find POWs that you can recruit as well. It's not a one-to-one comparison, but as I played, I certainly felt this connection strengthen. People turn into numbers so that they can raise other numbers, so that you can get better at taking more people to continue raising the numbers. And to what end? Building Mother Base out exemplifies the endless resource extraction that capitalism necessitates to feed the unflinching, ravenous need to always be making more. And like capitalism, this impulse naturally bends towards conquest and exporting the suffering to another nation, another people. Like with Amanda, we see Snake's charisma at work, his ability to connect with disaffected people. He can identify the holes in people's lives and fill them in with violence and struggle, while convincing them that that's the purpose they've been searching for, not unlike how the institutions of the capitalist world encourage a self-identification focused on selling your labor and the value you can create for a capitalist. Like I said, this doesn't all overlap super neatly, and I don't think Peace Walker's been built with specifically this read in mind, but there's room for it because Peace Walker does at least understand the time and place of its narrative. It's an inspired choice that's not been made lightly, allowing for a compelling integration of gameplay and theme. As Snake enters the temple grounds, he's faced with Dr. Strangelove, who's heading up the AI pod project for Peace Walker. She basically exists as a way to confront Snake with his lingering guilt and trauma from killing the boss in MGS3. We see this directly as Strangelove asks him why he did what he did, only for Snake to repeat the narrative constructed by the US government, falling back on his role as a soldier to avoid accepting what he did. Strangelove was in a relationship with the boss and has never gotten over her premature death, devolving into sycophancy. She chose the boss's mind to base the mammal AI pod off of, and that's how we've been hearing her voice. It's a really disconcerting dichotomy to watch unravel. Two people who love the boss, but in their inability to move on have either maintained a lie to themselves for a decade, or lost all perspective, trying in vain to recapture her, in the process creating a disturbing facsimile. Snake tries in vain to remove the AI cores from the pod, but passes out in the process, dreaming of his final encounter with a mentor. However, the conversation is a little different to its counterpart in Snake Eater, matching the US's lie that Snake's now internalized as a coping mechanism. It's fitting then that you now face the chrysalis weapon, preparing to finally transform into the butterfly Snake's been hunting. Once you've destroyed it, Kars then basically just spells out the text and subtext of the entire narrative sequence we've just covered, which is a problem in Peace Walker. Metal Gear games have always been a little too eager to explain themselves, but they also tended to have more thematic layers than Peace Walker, so the explanations could serve as legitimately helpful recaps now and then. Here they suck much of the satisfaction and fun from actually reading into the character intentions and plot developments. There's still some worthwhile thematic content, but the plotting is overwrought and blunt, which ties back into the game's pace problems. I touched on this earlier in regards to this open-ended potential for downtime between missions. Peace Walker can't predict how much time you're going to spend attaching your kidnapping balloon to CIA agents' belts, so it compensates not through constructing an intentionally episodic narrative, but by just repeating stuff at different intervals to account for those freaks who enjoy redoing the same annoying vehicle fights. This iteration of the codex contributes to the pacing issues. In actual fact, it's not really a codex at all. You can radio people during an operation, but you just get bog standard objective information. All other calls are just tapes of recorded conversations. The quality of the conversations hasn't dropped, and each person has their own expertise as usual, but you access them while prepping for a mission. This is neat because you can listen to tapes relevant to the upcoming mission, but it also left me spending more time than I anticipated between missions. The player-led naturalism of codex-based relationships from the earlier games, especially MGS 1-3, is all but gone. As a requirement of their format, each tape exists out of time almost, flattened to have happened in some nebulous moment instead of being things you experience in real time as part of your journey, and your choice to call that person in that moment. Again, these exchanges are still well executed in and of themselves, veering into surprisingly goofy or sincere moments to great effect, but are implemented in a less compelling way than previously, and one that typifies Peace Walker's inability to reorient its constituent parts around its new structure, which is what it ought to have done in my opinion. Snake moves onto the underground base that's been disguised as a mine, and you see Peace Walker being lowered down into it. Before you can give chase, the Cocoon vehicle shows up. The Cocoon is a massive weapon with a bunch of moving parts that you must physically climb to fully take down, which is quite cool, but this also makes it the most involved and tedious of these encounters, which is not cool. And then there's the aspect of these I've sort of buried the lead on. When you enter the AI pod to remove parts of its core at the end, they get put towards the Metal Gear Hugh is putting together for MSF, Zeke. This adds an element of strategy as the parts you acquire at the end are dependent on what you did and didn't destroy during the fight. And beyond that, it plays into a core dichotomy of Metal Gear fandom, which is knowing how much of the games are cautionary tales while also thinking it's dope as shit. Grey Fox comes to represent the very idea of betrayal and how war dehumanizes someone, but he's also a fun ninja, and likewise here in Peace Walker. You know MSF creating a Metal Gear of its own isn't good, but you can't deny that it's fun to have your own mech that you can turn pink. Building that mech, while adding another layer to the AI pod encounters, also relies on some element of randomness. This means you'll be redoing these encounters because you almost certainly won't get the parts you need your first time through. Across the 3 AI bosses, I probably did like 15 encounters, so like an hour and a half of repeating shit I didn't particularly like in the first place. Given the conversation we just had about pacing, I'm sure you can see how Peace Walker's contradictions are intensifying over time. With the Cocoon out of the picture, Snake heads underground and confronts the mammal pod. He's finally starting to accept that nothing substantial of the boss has been replicated within it as he tries in vain to get it to acknowledge her final mission. However, he gets captured by Strangelove and Coldman, taken to the torture room. Strangelove wants to know whether the boss actually did defect or not, but Snake refuses to give her the truth. Snake plays into his antagonism of the boss, really leaning into his lie and, in a sense, starting to project the front that is the identity of Big Boss. Internally, he knows the boss is no longer around and is beginning to accept that he won't ever have answers, but will shroud those emotions from everyone and create a facade that will help him build out a heaven and create his lineage. This process is exemplified by the mashing minigame of the torture, having to withstand abuse to protect yourself. We see this inference of legacy through how the torture scene is structured. Aesthetically, it's reminiscent of MGS3, but then invokes MGS1 and 2 by making you actually mash, as that was absent from Snake Eater. The sequence is capped off symbolically by your method of escape. The scar Snake has on his torso that we first saw all the way back in the introduction, that matches the boss's, is actually just a concealed wire which you then use to saw open the cell door. This symbol of the boss that would help close a wound, the wound of losing her, is all a farce, which is representative of how he appears to reconcile the unanswered questions he has for her. On some level it's dishonest, but it also allows him to escape and continue his larger project of expanding MSF. Things are complicating on that front. Paz can't be found anywhere, and with Galvez backed by the KGB and Coldman's CIA, it seems like things will collide and heat up soon. Snake heads to Peace Walker's bunker, and you find Paz, captured by Coldman and Strangelove. Coldman explains that he plans to launch a nuke on MSF, with the fallout drifting across the Caribbean and South America, destroying agriculture and leaving an opening for Peace Walker to be developed on a mass scale. Coldman's whole perspective here, that humanity must be kept in check by nuke-wielding robots, isn't any crazier than other Metal Gear villains' ideas, but it's also way less novel. So many stories have explored the idea of automation and AI from this exact angle and reasoning that Coldman feels derivative and, as a consequence, not much fun, unfortunately. Peace Walker is let loose to walk over to its launch point, but Snake gets its attention. The ornithologist can finally capture its butterfly. Peace Walker is cool in that it's a sort of proto-Rex in design, but in practice it's quite similar to the rest of these mech fights. You just lay into it with your most powerful weapons while dodging its very obviously telegraphed attacks, requisitioning ammo now and then. Perhaps the ease with which you take it down is purposeful deception, as it proves to have a second quadrupedal form, completing its transformation, not unlike a butterfly. It crawls off to the shore, and while you try to give chase, the boss's horse can't quite keep up. Peace Walker moving across the Rio San Juan into Nicaragua.
Life's end. Isn't it beautiful? It's almost tragic.
Snake stands over the injured horse, intercut with his killing of the boss in MGS3. Like that game, you have to actively pull the trigger, and with the horse put out of its misery, we see Snake definitively acknowledge the truth about his mission for the first time. After regurgitating the government's lie again and again, Snake's finally able to fully accept what he did, and why he did it. In doing so, he begins to completely embody the role of Big Boss. We see this in the next scene where he doesn't correct Kaz when he calls him boss, admitting he's grown attached to MSF. Having infiltrated the enemy facility, you must make your way to the communications tower, where Peace Walker will presumably be controlled from. You're vaulted out of jungles and small towns and into a military base, complete with its squarer layout and cooler colours. It has a similar tonal effect on gameplay as Groznygrad did in MGS3, helping keep things fresh and create connections to Big Boss's legacy. Weirdly, the guards in the base are Russian and not CIA. As Coldman explains his plan again, which will finally be underway once a code is input, Galvez enters, turning out to actually be called Zadornov. He pretended to side with Coldman so that he could basically recreate what Volgan does in MGS3, fire a nuke that appears to be sent by the US, thereby implicating them in an international incident that works against their interests, and in the interests of the Soviets. The more important thing is how Paz is used to shoot Coldman, a symbol of peace caught between conflict and forced into violence, representing how Costa Rica and Latin America broadly is being used on the world stage. It's then that MSF, notably the Sandinistas, bust in, saving Big Boss and restraining Zadornov, taking control back for themselves. It's nice to see Amanda's little arc complete of her truly becoming the Commandante in the eyes of her comrades. But Peace Walker ultimately errs on the side of seeing MSF as some ideologically neutral party in all this, which feels like a pretty naive, short-sighted read of the whole thing. Strangelove takes Big Boss to see the AI pod, still believing that it will reveal some unheard truth. Meanwhile, Paz and Zadornov just watch mouth agape as Coldman inputs the code to activate Peace Walker. The impetus for this finale is just completely dramatically impotent. The second these 20 minutes of cutscenes begins, you know it will end with you fighting Peace Walker, and there's little that happens during that 20 minutes that's actually valuable. You're just watching people repeat themselves over and over while it wrings its hands towards a conclusion you know is coming. And this is the same game I praised back at the intro for not divulging everything. It tries to sustain itself by having the Zadornov twist, but who actually gives a fuck about this guy? I've highlighted his thematic importance, but that only took 20 seconds. The ending of a Metal Gear game is usually trying its damnedest to weave together a dozen narrative and thematic threads, in the process creating something garish but glorious. Peace Walker's just reheating the same 2 or 3 threads it's been hammering the entire time, only to lead up to exactly what you expect, Peace Walker's activation causing a lot of panic, with the only resolution to be shooting at lots. Which does indeed prove to be the case, specifically about 15 minutes of shooting it. Although destroyed, Peace Walker's mammal pod is still sending the fake launch signal. Big Boss tries to convince the Pentagon that they're fakes, but people there are insistent on launching a retaliatory strike. The pod then opens and Big Boss hops in. As Big Boss removes the AI cores, he's dismantling this echo of the boss, this imposter, and continuing to assume his new role as Big Boss, as the kernel from which world history will be so influenced by. Fittingly, the boss AI begins rambling like the Colonel in Sons of the Patriots. First by repeating herself from MGS3, then spouting gibberish, and then recounting the numbers of pi like Sunny in MGS4. The butterflies around you morph into petals and back again as the boss's statements become vague, more broad. It's quite eerie and a nice turn to the surreal after so much logistical craft throughout the plotting of Peace Walker. With one final moment of lucidity, the mammal pod begins to sing, plunging Peace Walker into the ocean, definitively stopping the fake transmission. The butterfly remains free, choosing its own end. As far as endings go, I'd say it's incredibly corny. It has a lot of heart and appropriately builds to an emotional send-off, but the emotion it chooses to end on is incredibly one-note. When talking of the title screen, I brought up an element of tragedy that this story will never be public, another hidden narrative purposefully suppressed by those with power. As Peace Walker shifts its focus to the boss and people's want to know her final intentions, it starts to feel like a story not worth being made public. What's so affecting about the end of Snake Eater is precisely how the boss's intentions were exploited. So to loop back around to that topic just for the purpose of giving her a more positive ending via an AI that isn't even her in the first place is quite lackluster to me. This ending effectively uses the tricks it needs to come across as emotional, but isn't tapping into anything truly resonant. Peace Walker tries to have its cake and eat it too, by having its happy ending, but then during the logo talk having Snake reject it, feeling betrayed by the boss. But not only is this an insecure choice to try and have it both ways, but a repetitive one. We've seen how Big Boss has slowly accepted the mantle of his namesake, and in fact it feels more powerful and appropriate to me that we don't see him declare how he's changed, but rather observe it as it happens over time. We don't need this harped on again. But even then, things still aren't over. It's unclear exactly what this post-game chapter is building towards, but Peace Walker attempts to give it some structure and measure of progress by having Zadornov escape his cell, then having to recapture him. This will happen 6 or 7 times before you can actually end the chapter. Beyond being blatantly repetitive, it's not a good way to keep a player engaged. Not just because it gives you the impression that maybe this will just go on forever and not actually deliver an ending, but also because it means you have to fill time by completing side ops, as Zadornov will only subsequently escape after a few missions are completed. At this point, the contradictions between the game's structure and content cannot be reconciled and have spun out of control, creating inherent dissonance in the playing experience that ultimately feels cobbled together and limp. Peace Walker does at least start throwing out some more eccentric and varied side ops at you, and the tools you can develop with R&D follow suit while still being rooted in stealth gameplay. But it's sort of too little too late. They're throwing this more interesting side content at you after the credits of the game, after there's any good reason to remain invested in growing Mother Base. As I did these interesting puzzle-esque one-shot side ops and used new items like the decoy, I was mostly just left frustrated that Peace Walker held this fun stuff back until this point in the game. I think all this choice has going for it is how it puts a new perspective on the management and growth systems for MSF. With fewer extrinsic rewards being offered to the player, you become aware of how artificial and arbitrary all this work is. In that way, you potentially see Big Boss's actions in a new light. MSF grows just to grow, not in service of any larger purpose, and Big Boss blatantly becomes a war profiteer for the sake of it. Along the way, you can finally start to finish developing Metal Gear Zeke, and it gets equipped with the retrieved warhead from Peace Walker. I think this raises an interesting question about the idea of endless growth and min-maxing in a video game. It helps feed this instinctual need for progress, but given how video games tend to be themed and constructed, this progress is really just ever-increasing violence and death. The systems and mechanics Peace Walker leverages for thematic exploration get their hooks in a player, commentary moulding into wish fulfillment for its own sake, mirroring Big Boss's own descent into villainhood. One op that does arise in Chapter 5 is the date with Paz. This is some weird mission where you can use the short comms phrases intended for co-op play to raise your affinity with her, and depending how high that affinity gets, your mission rank will be higher. Getting an S rank involves raising affinity and then using a love box item, where Paz then gets in with Big Boss and something happens. Paz is of age, I suppose, strictly speaking, but Big Boss is like 15 to 20 years older than her, and Paz is clearly styled to be innocent and schoolgirl adjacent. Even in a less character-heavy title like Peace Walker, the Metal Gear series just can't help but insert some misogynistic lechery. Cars will also make some weird predatory comment whenever you fall into a female POW back to Mother Base.
Oh, alright.
Granted, as I've said a few times, Peace Walker is in large part about the transition into villainy, so the argument could be made that this machismo is part of that. But that would be a weak argument. This treatment of women is completely consistent with all the other games in the series, even when controlling unabashed heroes like Solid Snake. True to that consistency, I'm not surprised by Peace Walker's failure in this regard, but it's still juvenile and embarrassing. As you confront Zidornov for the final time, Snake killing him in the process, you find out that he's been acting as a diversion, as Paz has commandeered Metal Gear Zeke. You confront her on the deck of Mother Base, and she explains how she's been acting as an agent for Cypher, Major Zero's organization, the entire time. She lays out their plan, which is what they eventually achieve, the creation of the Patriots and the ambition to invisibly control the world and its narratives going into the digital age. Paz offers for MSF to be spared if they act as the mask for Cypher's operations. Snake declines, and so Paz rebuts by preparing to launch a nuke on the US, meaning you must take down Zeke. This is all quite sudden, but feels like a twist enmeshed in the game's themes, and more specifically its gameplay. The power Big Boss has accrued is used against him, and the reality of what MSS is made clear. It's an army without regulation, with no guardrails or means of control, and so can easily become a tool for evil if needed, with little recourse. I suppose this is also Peace Walker repeating itself a bit, calling into question the role the player takes on as the leader of MSF, but I think this is a way to bring those ideas to a point, to have the player actually confront them rather than just acknowledge them. I also think Paz is a good vector to channel this all through. She remains sort of mysterious the entire time and is surrounded with enough espionage that this turn is significant while not being out of the realm of possibility. It also makes her more interesting and dispels the one-note definition of her as a symbol of pure peace. The turn's also somewhat foreshadowed. In her very first appearance, she's wearing a red hood and presented as a victim of circumstance who just wants the world to work together. But when the hood is pulled back here at the end, Little Red Riding Hood turns out to be the wolf. The actual encounter with Metal Gear Zeke is great, the best boss fight in the game by far. It's scored by this less grounded but appropriately larger-than-life song that gives the whole thing so much energy. Zeke, as a smaller enemy, is more maneuverable and will switch fighting from long range or up close, which makes things more dynamic and varied. You can also use airstrikes from MSF to deal damage, and so there's a sort of mini objective to engage with throughout which adds more purpose to your decision making. Finally, unlike many of the other fights, which either feel inevitable or merely a way to progress towards an ending you can easily predict, the stakes feel much more real. You know the US isn't going to get nuked, but Peace Walker is finally making conflict between characters you care about, and using that conflict to reflect how you engage with the game mechanically, and what that engagement means. As Zeke is destroyed, Paz is flung out into the ocean, the mission complete. Sometime later, Kaz tells Snake that he knew about Paz and Zidornov the whole time, and that he used them to help MSF expand. He then lays out exactly how war and military action at large will change over time. Almost as though he has access to the scripts of games where all this has happened, essentially making him an omniscient agent of exposition and barely an actual character. Although taking on Zeke is a confrontation of what has been built by Big Boss and Kaz, they're so deep in their own victimized convictions that they interpret the inevitable scrutiny from their role in the Peace Walker incident as a threat, as a need to react by doubling down. They see MSF as a revolution, but are by their own admission not ideological. Their revolution is completely empty and nihilistic. It has no vision for the future outside of itself, just the proliferation of conflict for its own sake. Basically, they want to take the events of playing Peace Walker and change it from a smaller, more contained story to one that encompasses the whole world. And considering what comes next, Metal Gear as a series seems to share those ambitions.
The hunt is on, Kaz. And the whole world's on our tail. Assemble the men.
Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker is a tough game to nail down. The hardware constraints should feel limiting, but then instead prove as an avenue through which to explore more systemic and structural ambition. The well-worn themes threaten to be dull and redundant, but are ultimately uplifted by a fascinating setting that the game shows real dedication to. Choosing to follow Big Boss again feels ill-advised, but then manages to actually explore his character rather than just doubling down on what we already know. In so many areas, Peace Walker proved my assumptions wrong and became even more enjoyable on this second playthrough that I approached with the original handheld hardware in mind. But in all these cases, I was only proved wrong for so long. The new superstructure of managing Mother Base starts out as a really genius idea and implementation, not just in the sense of playing the game, but what playing the game means thematically and what it reflects about the player's role in that playing. But as you progress, it has less and less new to offer, and settles into a rather rote process of accumulation and development of resources. What was exciting and cause for introspection mellows out into a set of ideas that feel both too complicated to bother investing in and too simple to feel rewarded by engaging with. As you work your way through the story, the initial focus on imperialism throughout Latin America, which is rendered with surprising passion and depth, is pushed aside to make room for overly familiar melodrama, and a further investment in a character who already had their ending, the boss. Peace Walker shifts its focus on new characters away from genuinely interesting people like Chico and Amanda and onto cookie-cutter villains like Coldman and Strangelove. The level of nuance they do have isn't new for the series, and they're wrapped up in a weedy plot that's content retracing old ideas. Exploring peace under the context of a revolutionary group trying desperately to secure self-determination for their people is way more interesting than exploring peace under the context of nuclear proliferation and deterrence, considering the series has done so multiple times already. Big Boss suffers the same fate. Focusing on the Sandinistas opens up new sides of him, allowing for a naturalistic exploration of how he became the Big Boss we know in later games. But as the story shifts its priority to the boss more explicitly, Peace Walker begins repeating itself. Snake's arc of finally becoming Big Boss is effectively complete after the torture sequence, when he's removed his imitation scar and is ready to face the mammal pod. But then the game just reiterates how he's now Big Boss over and over, spending 2 chapters of this 5-chapter game doing so, getting less subtle with each mention. And this is where most of Peace Walker's problems come from. It's an ambitious game with so many great concepts that work surprisingly well, but soon enough it just runs out of steam, either unable to find new directions to head in or unable to admit when the ones it's already explored should be left as they are. As it runs too long and fails to sustain itself, the homogeneity of Peace Walker's gameplay rises to the top. You find yourself in the same environments, with access to the same tools, completing the same objectives many times over. There is generally a path of least resistance gameplay-wise in most Metal Gear Solid games, to just tranquilize everyone and be on your way. But there tends to be enough going on that I want to experiment and try new things. But in Peace Walker, so much of your gameplay is not in service of anything worth experimenting to achieve, and the tools you can truly experiment with only become available past the point of wanting to be spending more time than I have to on the game. Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker is half of an incredible game, thematically bold, structurally ambitious and fascinating, and bursting with the heart and fun narrative developments the series is known for, with some cool stylistic shakeups to boot. But its other half is a solved game. You've played it all before, heard it all before, thought about it all before, and the vast majority of this repetition is found in the back 50% of the game, making for a lopsided playthrough that can really test your patience, and prove disappointingly stock for a series known for its unflinching vision. I suppose the journey really is better than the destination, because while chasing the butterfly was a ton of fun, actually having to then catch it certainly wasn't.